Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In the era before the Civil War, and kind of those decades leading up to it, we saw America really come of age. This is still the early days of our nation, but there's still a feeling that in these early days, our country isn't as good as it could be, or that there are some deep underlying problems that need to be addressed, whether those things are addressed as by the governments or by individual people or by churches or however it is, there's a real sense of social reform. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify the major movements and goals of antebellum reform. Antebellum is a Latin word. Ante means before, and bellum means the war. So we're talking about some social reform efforts before the Civil War. And number 22, you should be able to identify the diverse sources of antebellum women's rights movements and explain its significance. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 21. Here I'm going to use a term that you may be familiar with, but to kind of backtrack a little bit on it, it's the term utopia. Utopia is an imaginary, most perfect society. And there were about 100 of these reform communities in the utopian model that were established in the decades before the Civil War. They were usually small villages that would hopefully grow into towns, the areas. They oftentimes had a religious movement, although there were certainly secular utopian movements as well. Nearly all of the communities set out to reorganize society on a cooperative basis. This cooperative basis hoped to restore the social harmony that felt like it was missing in the early 19th century America, and specifically like cooperation against individualism, and also to narrow the widening gap between rich and poor. Socialism and communism, while these concepts might have existed for a while, this language was introduced into the language, the terms socialism and communism. They're as a codified understanding of as a political philosophy, they're just really emerging here at this time. And most tried to find substitutes. So a lot of these 100 social reform communities, they often tried to find kind of substitutes for conventional gender relations and marriage patterns. So a lot of times these communities have, I think we could say, awkward marriage situations. The word utopia is not a new word. It actually comes from a 16th century book of political philosophy / novel. They were kind of the same thing in the 16th century, by St. Thomas More. That imagined what a perfect society would look like. That word utopia would come down to us today. And one of these communities I want to talk about first are the Shakers. The Shakers were the most successful of all of the religious communities, and they had a significant impact on the outside world. The Shakers were a religious community that believed that God was both male and female, that God had this dual personality. And so, in the eyes of the Shakers, men and women were spiritually equal. Although they were spiritually equal, Shakers lived apart, where there were men communities and women communities, because they were abandoning a traditional family life. They didn't have any private property. Everything was owned in community. And like the traditional family life was totally separate. The men lived in one place and the women lived in another. Their population didn't grow the old-fashioned way of natural increase, but it did grow by converts. Shakers were also good at adopting orphans, people that needed to get got. The Shakers would go find them and raise them up. They were economically successful, and the Shakers were probably among the most successful of all of these utopian groups because they were very good farmers, growing vegetables and herbs and breeding cattle, and in particular furniture making. And actually a Shaker style still exists today. Kind of this kind of noble simplicity of the Shaker movement. It's still really appealing today. Subpoint C. The next group I want to talk about is based in the city of Oneida. And it's traced to kind of a peculiar man named John Humphrey Noyes. He started a religious utopian community in Vermont. They became notorious for, I think the simplest way we could say it is complex marriages. The way it would work was that any man could propose to any woman any type of sexual relations, and she had the right to reject or accept the proposition. But that also meant that like traditional marriage understandings, none of that really applied anymore. He was indicted for adultery, a crime, in Vermont, and moved the entire community to Oneida, New York in 1848. And there it survived for a surprisingly long time until 1881. Oneida was an extremely dictatorial environment. To join the Oneida community, you had to demonstrate knowledge of John Humphrey Noyes' personal religious beliefs, his religious teachings. You also had to agree to live by the rules of the community, including determining which people had the right to have babies and which one didn't. The Oneida community was a complicated community. It actually persisted, like I said, until the 1880s. Its most successful piece of product was really good flatware, like making silverware and stuff, and Oneida still exists as a brand of cutlery. Subpoint D. The next group I want to introduce you to are the Owenites. The Owenites were a secular movement. It wasn't a religious movement. Quite a few of these are religious movements. The Owenites were a secular group, and it was based around the idea of Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a British factory owner who moved to the United States and established a community. So he had first established in Scotland, but then he moved to the United States in 1824 into a town called New Harmony, Indiana. There he founded this New Harmony, Indiana to be a new moral world. Children weren't raised in their families. Children were removed from their parents to be educated in specific Owenite schools. The schools would train people to value the common good over their own individual ambition. New Harmony was a strong champion of women's rights. He said that wives wouldn't be enslaved to their husbands, but would be autonomous creatures to make their own decisions, or at least the decisions within the bounds of the New Harmony community. New Harmony failed. It failed after a few years of squabbling. It just wasn't enough glue to hold it together. But it was strongly influential on the labor movement, in education reform, and on women's rights. Some of these religious reform movements, subpoint E, some of these religious reform movements drew their inspiration from the religious revivalism of the Second Great Awakening. That moral energy of the Second Great Awakening was carried over here in the communities. They popularized an outlook known as perfectionism that saw that both individuals and society were largely capable of indefinite improvement, as if suddenly people are free from the effects of from the fall, right? Under the impact of revivals, older reform efforts suddenly moved in a new, more radical direction. The American Temperance Society emerged that directed its effort at both drunkards and the occasional drinker as these pieces that were holding people back from their inevitable future perfection. Subpoint F. Here I also want to introduce an idea that's not exactly a utopian movement, at least specifically a utopian movement, but it's the idea of the common school, a school for common people. And it was a tax-supported public school system. It's really the foundation of public schooling, and it was widely adopted in the northern part of the country. And we would look at maybe the leading educational reformer of this day as a person named Horace Mann. Horace Mann hoped that universal education, getting everybody an education, would restore equality to a deeply fractured society. It was to be an avenue for social advancement, but also to prepare students for work in a new industrial economy. And with Horace Mann, you see really a movement in education in two ways that still endure today. One, believing that schools can solve all the social ills, and two, that the social ills basically revolve around you getting a good job at school, from schools. The common school did provide career opportunities to women who came mostly to be teachers. The common schools were very common in the northern part of the country. Common schools are very common, that's kind of redundant, but they were very common in the northern part of the country. They were not very common in the south, where cotton farming really persisted and was seen as a much better avenue towards wealth and success there. Roman numeral number 22. Here I want to talk about kind of the early days of feminism. We don't even call it like first wave feminism. It's more like proto-feminism, but it comes about with the rise of women in the public sphere. The public sphere was open to women in ways that government and party politics were not. Women don't have universal right to vote, and they can't run for office, but to be influential just in society, that's never been denied, right? People always have a voice. Now, You could say that the voice were limited at various parts in American history, and I think that's fair. But we also have so many notable exceptions of women making their voice heard nevertheless. But we really see in these years before the Civil War that women step out onto the stage a lot more prominently. They are circulating petitions, they're attending public social meetings, they're marching in political parades. Just because women don't have the right to vote in this era doesn't mean that their voice can't be heard. They're delivering public lectures and raising money for causes, proving to be excellent fundraisers. Participation in abolitionism, in particular, the idea of ending slavery, participation in abolitionism inspired the early movement for women's rights. As women were lecturing in public about abolition and really taking that stage on an issue they felt strongly about. And here we meet two sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They were abolitionist sisters of the 1830s and really notable people. They argued against the idea that taking a part in assemblies or demonstrations or lectures was somehow inherently unfeminine. And they used their public controversy as a platform for greater women's rights. The Grimke sisters have this great moment where they grow up in a slaveholding family and demanded an early payment of their inheritance, basically saying, we want assets and slaves from our plantation to be given to us. And then they turn around and immediately sell all the, basically give all the slaves their freedom. They don't sell their slaves, they give the slaves their freedom. And they divest themselves of the assets of the farm and basically say, we are out of the slave business, we are out of the slave holding business, and then this is the moral future. The Grimke sisters questioning, putting their own futures in risk for a cause they believed in. Subpoint B. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott took a different approach for raising the rights of women. They organized the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Both Stanton and Mott were veterans of the anti-slavery movement, so it's not like they didn't believe in the cause, but that's not what we traditionally associate with them today. They were used to organizing for social issues and took that organization at the Seneca Falls Convention to go argue for greater women's rights. It specifically raised the issue of women's suffrage, and suffrage means the right to vote. It specifically raised the issue of women's suffrage, as well as women's access to education and employment, and that men took priority over women in causes of divorce, and all of these issues that felt like women were getting the short end of the stick at. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the main author of a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments condemned the entire structure of inequality. It was largely modeled after the Declaration of Independence, to go see those promises of the revolution carried out more effectively to people, of the day. The Declaration of Sentiments demanded that all men and all women were created equal. You got to remember that in the 1830s and the 1840s, the revolution is still within living memory, although there's not a lot of people left by that point. It's definitely second generation, and the ideas of liberty and freedom still persuade Americans of this time. The last person I want to talk about before we move out of this subpoint is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a slave who had escaped from slavery, and then she turned abolitionist to go argue for the elimination of slavery. And she insisted that this greater women's rights movement pay attention to the poor and working class women, that it couldn't be a movement of middle class and rich women, but instead focus on the poor and working class that can't go to things like Seneca Falls, and to remember their rights as well. Subpoint C. Women's rights advocates also demanded that women should be protected by the state and get specific government protections as a class of people against violence at the hands of their husbands, saying that right now women are subjected to the treatment of their husbands, and that needed to stop, and that the state should step in, that the government should step in and protect the vulnerable parts of society. Women challenged the notion that claims for justice and freedom and individual rights, they say that those things shouldn't stop at the household door. Once you enter the house doesn't mean that a claim to rights and protection stop existing. It was a repudiation, it felt like, of the cult of domesticity from the earlier part of this APUSH period that said that within the house, that's a protected sphere. The issue of women's private freedom revealed the underlying differences in the movement between women's rights. and I think we really see that this understanding of what it means to be a free woman, a person of rights, and how that would be carried out. You really do see the seeds of unrest sown here. Subpoint D. When organized abolitionism split into two different wings into 1840. So the argument against slavery, a social reform movement, split in 1840. And the immediate cause was over this question of what role women could play in the movement. And the two groups have very similar names. And to just you have to make this distinction in your head between one side is the American Anti-Slavery Society. The American Anti-Slavery Society allowed women to take leadership positions within the organization. On the other hand, you have a little more conservative approach to abolition. So it's still an abolitionist movement, but within kind of traditional gender roles. The American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society opposed women in leadership positions. And I don't really have a good way to give you to distinguish between those two groups, except that the one that's the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society doesn't have women's leadership. And they just got I don't have a good distinction on that one. There was also a political movement that showed up that grew up as a third party. We often hear, clamoring of like, why don't third parties exist? And I think the first real significant third party that shows up emerges here in 1840 as the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was a political party established in hopes of making abolitionism to be a political movement. The Liberty Party was politically unsuccessful, like a lot of third-party movements are, because people considered it a throwing away their vote movement, saying the Liberty Party can't actually win elections. And even if I think that abolitionism is an important position and somebody needs to be the champion for it, the Liberty Party just is a horse that won't cross. This question, though, of how you're going to take political reform. If it's going to happen through political channels, through the voting box, through agitations in the streets, through social movements, all of these things lay the seeds for the future unrest, but also the future direction of the country. It's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.